Go ahead.
For all the behind the scenes work that makes these programs possible. As you all just got the warning, we record these sessions so that folks can watch them later on Blue Sky's social media channels. And it's pretty interactive. If you haven't been here before, haven't been here in a while, and you're welcome to use both the chat, if that's your preferred way to communicate, or the raise hand feature. Don't actually raise your hand, because when I start sharing things, I can't see people anymore, but the raise hand feature is in the reactions, probably at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you can't figure out how to use that feature, but you want to raise your hand, you can just type in the chat, raise hand, please, and we'll call on you. And we always start our programs by acknowledging that Blue Sky exists on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualet and Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Wimal and Willamette rivers. And in this online format, you may be participating from another area, and we invite you to consider your own land acknowledgement as reflects your location. And we also want to acknowledge that the very technology that we rely on for these online programs is inequitably distributed and not equally accessible, which creates new virtual displacements and exclusions. And we say this to call attention to the need for action now and in the future to address these disparities. If anybody is new to the Salon or hasn't been here in a while, this really replicates something that I had started doing in the gallery years ago at Blue Sky, which is thinking about how we could create community by engaging around photography and also poetry, not just coming in and seeing the work on the walls, but finding opportunities to talk about it together and to build our understanding and build connections to each other as we do that. I always say I'm going to ask a lot of questions. These are not questions for which there are one right answer. It's about our reflection and how we build understanding together. And I will urge you to resist the impulse to do internet searches while we are having this conversation, because I think that is about trying to find a right answer as opposed to really taking the time for the kind of reflection and observation that these sessions are meant to encourage. And I think this session, I'm going to just jump in and show a piece that's hanging in the gallery. And in some ways, this is a better exercise if you have no other information about this image or the body of work that it comes from. And I don't know how true that will be for folks here, but I'm going to share my screen and then jump right in. Let me take a moment to get there. Voila. So just look at this photo. And again, better in some ways if you don't know anything about it, just based on what you are seeing in front of you, how would you read this photo? And what kind of associations might it conjure up for you? And again, feel free to either use the raise hand feature or the chat to jump into the discussion. Where do we start in reading a photo like this? Oh, Molly, looks like you have a hand up. Why don't you unmute yourself?
Well, I'm just thinking about sense of place. You know, it's an image that could perhaps take place anywhere, or an action that could in fact take place anywhere. But I think like when I look at it, I want the kind of the specificity of place. It might conjure up a lot of different kinds of connotations. I don't know, but there's the notion of the Wild West, and the idea of kind of entering into a place or a space that is perhaps unknown or vast, kind of, sort of like uncovering new territory. So those kind of associations that make us think about what we're doing on, what are people doing on horseback, a sense of travel, but also maybe a sense of flight. So yeah.
Right. So I would maybe push back a little bit on the first thing you said about it could happen anywhere. Because like, this is definitely not the food court of the suburban mall where I hung out as a teenager. It's not even the parking lot of the suburban mall where I hung out as a teenager. But I think you're right that coming from the US, we have a notion of the West that this might conjure up, although it could really be any place where there's land and horses and people who ride horses. And that I think what you're getting at is that there's nothing that ties it to a particular place or region where that might be the case. And I think especially because we have had a number of blue sky shows in recent months that focused on the American West in some ways, it was hard for me when I saw this not to think about the West and the Western as sort of genre informing this, although it is a very different space. And maybe I should just stop being coy and advance the slides one. And that's the title of the piece, Killing the Apostates in Revenge for the Monotheists, Khorasan number 3. So like, to me, this is one of those instances where a title might really change our response to the image. So how does the title do that for any of your responses to the image? Does it answer questions or does it raise questions? What does the title do for your interpretation?
Well, and Harper was saying in the chat that there's the reference that Justina made in her talk to the references of this image in and of itself. And I think about that too, as someone who studied the history of images and photography. But I think that, but I think what the title does do is establish that place and that time and that moment and that action that is otherwise unclear.
So I'm going to put maybe Molly and Harper or other folks who heard the talk, which I did not, on the spot and say, for those of us who haven't heard the talk, but maybe also those of you who know me know my tricks. And one is that this is in some ways about personal response and not just saying, well, the photographer or the poet would give us the right answer. So maybe if you want to explicate it a little bit, not just in terms of, well, this is what Justina had to say, but how does that shape your own response to the piece? You saw it before you heard it spoken about. Harper, want to take any of that on?
Yeah, I mean, I can elaborate a little bit more in that kind of when you asked us to kind of like, what do you think about this? I mean, she very clearly, like in her talk, like references like Western imagery and is particularly like the cowboy films of, you know, the West. So it was really hard to like step aside from that reference. Obviously, I mean, I think other people would still come to that because it's pretty, pretty clear in some ways, but I just, yeah, that's kind of all I can think about now. So I didn't really want to offer another kind of perspective because that was really out for me.
And as I said, that sort of is what I came to, not having heard the talk, just when I first saw the image in the gallery and looking at it again in the digital version that we're looking at now. But that still kind of begs the question, and clearly the photographer has chosen to pair it with this particular title, but if we come to this with cowboy imagery in mind, what does a title like Killing the Apostates in Revenge for the Monotheists, Khorasan number 3, how does that shape how we're responding to this particular piece? And again, this is not a right answer question. I'm really just curious about what does that title conjure or change for any of us?
Chris has his hand up.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it, if I don't know what the picture is, which is hard for me to say because I have known for a long time what the picture is, but it looks to me more like Native Americans. It doesn't look like the cowboys. It looks like the Indians. And
can you say what gives you that impression, just to kind of push us on our close reading?
Well, there seems to be a more loose, flexible, comfortable relationship between the horses and the riders. They don't look like they're soldiers. They look like they're kind of more connected with their steed. Anyway, but once I think that those look like soldiers, and then I look at this title, it's like, well, killing the apostates and revenge for the monotheists sounds like killing the heathens to protect Christianity, which was part of our the effort of Europeans all across the Americas. So,
right. So
unfortunately, it translates too well.
Right. So if you are reading this in terms of settler and frontier, there's an analogy there. And Ken has put in the chat, I think it's Ken, sometimes people appear on Zoom with a screen name that is not themselves. And so I'm going to call you Ken, saying maybe they have long flowing hair. And I'm not sure if that's hair that we're seeing or possibly fabric wrapped around the head, but it definitely does seem, it's not cowboy hats and boots and spurs. So it moves us away from cowboy drag, if you will, to something that I think fits with the reading that Chris was offering. And see, you've got a hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, for me, I don't get cowboy at all when I look at these, because looking at the figures, I see them more as hooded. So I think even prior to having much knowledge about the background of the images, I never went to cowboy myself. It's just like, I think I zero in on the central figure, and yeah, I think it's more of like, who are these? They're mysterious because they seem like they're masked, or you can't see their faces. You don't know who they are. I guess I don't get the Western narrative for me at all in that. So, but then it's also like, I kind of knew a little bit about her work already. So it was like, I get more like, yeah, Middle Eastern, but I'm like, well, why is that? Okay, I know a little bit more about this, but I think I think what you were saying, that's what I was kind of coming to as well. And for me, I guess the title kind of just keeps me still a little like scratching my head a bit. And maybe that's just because I'm not as familiar of like the term apostates, or, I guess that's something I don't come across a lot either. So I guess for me, I'm still I feel like it's very mysterious, even with the title.
So it doesn't explicate, maybe raises some questions, and I'm not even sure what you might say those questions are. And Ken has added in the chat that the tone of this feels like the sepia tone that we think of as historical photos, which we associate with the West. I also associate them actually with those fake photo booths, the old-fashioned photo booths that my family would go to sometimes on a vacation in a touristy area, where you would take the fake Western picture in definitely in cowboy drag. And that actually, Ken, this work is a function of how these are printed, which with the very odd material of using gunpowder as part of the prints. So that's the way that we are trying to make sense of an unusual photographic process by associating it, I think, to work that is more familiar to us. Molly, you've got a hand up.
Yeah, speaking to Ken's comment, I think to me they also conjure up images of like our Roger Fenton's early work. First, one of the first photographers to capture war on film. Or not film, but as a photograph. And so sort of that harkens back to a look that it is historic, or from centuries gone by. So I think, there's a purpose to that, probably on the, on the part of the artist, but it does conjure up those, even the Civil War images that were not clear and that were hard to capture action. You really couldn't at that time. But obviously by this time,
Yeah,
you can.
This much horse movement was not possible in Civil War era photos, but to come back to that, this monotheists and the apostates, like for me, Chris tied it to the language of colonizing settlers in the Western US and probably the Western part of Canada as well. But to me, it also, I think, can feel very Middle Eastern in that distinction of monotheism as an early distinguisher of both Judaism, Islam, but also Christianity, sort of not counting necessarily those faiths in its own religious warrings. But I also feel like I'm not sure who the apostates are referenced in this image, who the monotheists are, why they need to be avenged in some way, what Khorasan is. And I think that to me, there's also just that question of what's the effect when an artist, whether a photographer or in another medium, chooses to put the title to a visual work that confounds us rather than kind of enlightens us, and what is that effect about? Harper, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I guess, kind of elaborating, kind of drawing from what both you and Molly have said. I think, if you don't understand what the majority of the text means, that there's it imbues it with a violence that you don't necessarily read into it without the title, which I think, if you see it without the title, you might read it in a much more, I guess, mundane way, not mundane, but, without necessarily that violent connotation that the title brings into it.
Yeah, the very first word is killing, and that's as dramatic as violence gets. Unless anybody has more thoughts or questions about this one, I might jump us to our next image. So anything else anybody wants to comment on or ask? All right, let's see what's next. So take a little moment with this picture and think about, or image, where does your eye go first versus what do you notice only after looking at it for a longer while? And I'll give you a little time to work around those thoughts.
Chris, has the hand raised?
My eye goes first to the right-hand frame where the building is the closest, and I try to peer into the building through the sort of openings in it, and then I kind of look around at the sort of the scale of the devastation. But I start with the specific and move to the general, I would say.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. The specific is also in terms of the perspective, what we are nearest to, and so where it seems like we might find and where we crave some information. And I appreciate you confessing to your desire to peer in people's windows, a desire I often share. But then also thinking about as you said, the scope of devastation, that there's a way that we only get that information once we start to look across the panels. Other things, specific or general, that you either noticed right away or that you noticed looking over it with more time?
Well, I would say that, because it's a triptych, I mean, that's what draws me in first, in the relationship of these three images together. And I actually start on the left-hand side and move forward like I'm reading a text or something. And then I guess what I see next is kind of this repetition of form, and the textures that I think, as Chris mentioned, sort of you get the scope of the devastation as you hone in on some of the details. So
Can you just explain a little bit when you say repetition of form? What do you mean?
well, I'm looking at, because it's architecture that is similar. The forms are similar, and I'm kind of like looking for that in each. I kind of look at these as individual images rather than together, even though you step back and see them together. So I think that makes that stronger. Like it punches, I think, the images, or reinforces the images, and maybe therefore reinforces the devastation of, you imagine maybe what this was before as pristine buildings, and then the crumbling effect. But then the forms that retain themselves, the shape of the windows and the doors, so that, it's almost like the skeleton of the structure is still there. But then there's all this messy stuff down below. So that kind of contrast of the sharp and the much more chaotic is interesting to me.
And I would say, as you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about is the way that these are produced. We don't have a lot of color differentiation, right? So that if we were looking at this scene, we might see more differentiation across these buildings because they might be different colors, right? But we lose that, so that I think it contributes to the effect that you're talking about of sort of making the form more similar than it might be. And of course, we don't know what's missing from these buildings that might have differentiated them prior to this level of destruction. See, there's a comment in the chat, right? So Ken says, it seems to be a scene empty of life. And definitely trying to look for the human in this particular scene. It's difficult to pick anything out. I think some of that is also, there may not be people moving about. How long and how many times did I look at this image before I noticed that there seems to be an overturned vehicle in the right-hand panel? And I wonder about what other things are there that I have not yet noticed, even taking as much time as I have to look at this image. Are there other pieces like that besides? I feel like we talked about buildings and we talked about just kind of debris and devastation. I brought up that vehicle. Are there other things in this image that we haven't noted yet that you've noticed?
Chris?
Well, in the left frame, there's a couple of sort of ant-shaped things that might be people walking around. There's one, yes, right there, yes, right there, yes.
Yeah, I hadn't even noticed. So possibly some human forms, but far in the background and difficult to differentiate. Harper, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I think what stood out to me was the satellite dishes, because otherwise it feels kind of timeless. Like this is like without much form, and especially like the mono chromatic nature of it. But then it kind of brings it into kind of a timeliness with kind of this indication of like more contemporary technology. Yeah,
and it's interesting to think about how that technology reads against the rest of the image, right? It is not just that it cites it in a moment of time, but like the overturned truck might tell us something about our expectations about when this might have or ought to have occurred versus when it may have. I'm also noticing as we talk that in the panel on the left, it looks like something's been hung maybe from the over the windows of the very left side of that building. And I wonder too, if that's an indication of habitation, that is to say people trying to create, whether it's privacy or weather protection or even protection from debris. I can't quite tell, but that looks like it's not part of the building, but maybe an overlay, but that's just me guessing. So one of the things I'm really curious about with this particular piece is how we respond to it based on the fact that it's a triptych, which may be a function of how it was produced. Maybe you couldn't make a piece this big as this is in when you see it in the gallery, with this technique without splitting it into pieces. I don't know, but I'm less concerned about that piece of it than like, what's the effect of it as a triptych? How would we respond to it differently if it were just one large image? I finally got to do that thing that everybody gets to do on Zoom, which is have their cat come. My cat has not attended any Blue Sky events until tonight, but it's very excited to be here. The cat does not know what a triptych is, however, so will not be answering that question. I have to leave it to all of you. Chris?
Well, I do these kind of assembled panoramas myself, so I'm very sort of used to it. But I do think it's interesting. I mean, when Molly was talking about, you know, starting at the left and reading it left to right, there is a way that this image, in addition to being just like one continuous scene that you're seeing through a divided window pane, it also can feel like a sequence of images, like that the one on the left is first and the next one is second, this one is third or something. It does bring a sort of time discontinuity possibility to the table, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So that we read something into the division, and that time is one thing that we might read in. Ken has put in the chat that it can also conjure up crucifixion paintings, which are a very familiar triptych form for people who are familiar with European painting, right? That's also a place where you might know triptychs from. I think for me, in some ways, it makes that question of the scale of destruction more profound. It's like the implication is that you couldn't capture all of this in one image, that there's so much has been affected and devastated here that it takes 3 images to convey it. And again, I'm not saying that that is literally true about the process, but that's the effect it has for me as a viewer, is to feel like it somehow makes it a more massive level of devastation because it has to be read across multiple panels in order to represent or experience the representation of it. Any other thoughts on either the images and the title, which we haven't talked about at all?
Well, one thing I was just thinking about in terms of the triptych is, you know, I sort of take them as individual images, and as I read them as individual images, and then what that means to look at them together. And you know, I'm reiterating what many of you have said, but it's more profound, I think, in trying to convey a message. And actually, I think much more interesting. If I'm just like isolating an image, I think it doesn't tell the whole story that the triptych can do.
Yeah, and Ken has added in the chat that the spaces between each of the images slow us down, slow our eye down as we're moving across. So I think it also is asking us or pushing us to do more of a slow read, which allows us or forces us to notice more detail as we go. Yeah, the speed bumps of the visual, says Chris. Any more thoughts on this before we move on, or questions?
Well, just in reference to the title, I would say, I mean, it just goes to show like what does it mean to fight for our enemy? This is the result, or these are the consequences. And what does that mean, fighting for our enemy? So,
Yeah, those are, I mean, two really different questions. When I was writing the description for tonight's program, I wrote about the cost of war on soldiers and on civilians. And I think I also said, and on civilizations, right? Because this is a really profound example of what the fighting for our enemy, what that fighting results in, right? Which is this level of destruction. But yeah, the question of fighting with my enemy or against my enemy as opposed to for my enemy, again, clearly a title that seems to not be meant to explain everything that we're looking at, but maybe to even push us with more questions or more uncertainty about how to make sense of what we're looking at, which may be the entire point of this body of work. How do you make sense of the way that war is being represented in attempts to entice people to fight? Any more thoughts?
Chris has a comment.
Yeah, I just as you're sort of talking about, are there technical reasons for this stuff and what's happening with these titles and stuff? We actually know the answers to these things, but I don't want to short circuit your presentation by saying where the titles come from, whatever, or what the technical things are. So you can sort of let us know when you're ready to have that the non-Wikipedia, but the answer kind of come plopping down.
An answer. I mean, for me, it's a question. When I ask these questions, I try not to ask them in ways that are where it's about what's the effect for us looking at them, trying to make sense of them, rather than trying to get to, well, this is, the question about whether all of the meaning, cover your ears, photographer Chris, whether the artist or the writer puts all the meaning into the piece, or whether the meaning comes from how audiences respond to a piece and interpret a piece. And that's the big debate, right? So I think that's also part of why I don't want us to fall back on, oh, luckily we know from the artist talk or from the book or from the website where the particular title came from. It's more a question of what happens to us when we're looking at the work with the title. Speaking of poetry, I might move us to a poem if we're ready. Yeah. So this is a poem by Brian Turner, and I will read it once through and then ask you to do something with it. Phantom noise. There's this ringing hum, this bullet-borne language, ringing, shellfall and static, this late night ringing of threadwork and carpet, ringing, hiss and steam, this wing beat of rotors and tanks, broken, bodies ringing in steel, humming, these voices of dust, these years ringing, rifles in Babylon, rifles in Sumer, ringing these children their gravestones and candy, their limbs gone missing, their static-born television, their ringing, this eardrum, this rifled symphonic, this ringing of midnight in gunpowder and oil, this brake pad gone useless, this muzzle flash singing, this thread of bullets in muscle and bone, this ringing hum, this ringing hum, this ringing. So for those of you who don't traffic in poetry as much as I do, this poem makes great use of something called caesura, a wonderful word that I will put in the chat, which are pauses in the middle of a line. And some poets, when they are indicating caesura, will use a comma or a period in the middle of a line rather than at the end of a line with a line break. And in this poem, Brian Turner does it just with extra spaces. So when I read it out loud, I tried to give those spaces, similar actually to Ken's comment about the spaces in the triptych slowing us down. And before we talk about the poem, you can all be muted for this next bit, but read the poem out loud for yourself and try and articulate those pauses as pauses And I'm interested in what phrases you notice more when you read the poem yourself than perhaps when you see it out loud, than when you see it on the page or when I read it to you. So take a moment and read it out loud to yourself. So what were there particular phrases that you noticed more reading the words out loud, and which ones were they? Harper?
I think it was this, and there. You know, this late night, this swing beat, and then their limbs, and their, what was the other one? Gravestones, and then this rifle. And yeah, just kind of separating into, it kind of made it feel like the poet was actually the actor, and it was acting upon something with this and there.
Yeah, so it is a huge amount of repetition that I didn't even notice until you pointed it out, which kind of, it creates a particular rhythm, I think, in any poem to have that kind of repetition, especially at the beginning of phrases. This thing, their thing, that, their thing. And I think maybe you're getting at this, right? When you learn a foreign language, you realize that this means something close by and those mean something far away, right? So this brings us close to something, and there, because it belongs to somebody else, pushes it away. So there's also a sort of up close and push away, up close and push away, I think that's happening in those words as you draw our attention to them. Other things that folks noticed? Chris, I think your hand is up.
Yeah, well, for me, their limbs gone missing. To have to say those words myself increases their impact as opposed to hearing somebody else say them.
Yeah, that we take a deeper notice of these bodies harmed when we actually have to articulate it ourselves. Other lines or parts of the poem that really struck folks or that you have questions about? Ken is talking about the threading of bullets. And I'm trying to find, right, the thread work and threading of bullets. They come farther apart in the poem, but it's a repetition of sound with a real, I think, contrast of images, if I'm understanding what you're drawing our attention to, right? Thread work and carpet is one set of, conjures up one visual image for me, whereas threading of bullets in muscle and bone is totally different. And one is about the creation of things or the beautiful cultural production versus this horror of, and destruction of the threading of bullets. I hadn't noticed that, thank you. And as Christopher points out, it also, this, there, threading, thread work. Molly?
I've had this experience in the other poems that you've had us read out loud, but I think that reading out loud reinforces or brings forth, I think, the visual images even more strongly as we're saying them, because it's almost like we take over that voice of the poet or the narrator. And I also felt like there was an interesting thread of, I mean, it's the presence and the existence of war across time and culture. Like I felt like this is something that has been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries, and it's made up our world as we know it. And going back to the image we were, even the first image we were looking at and talking about this, the timelessness of it, I think that Harper had mentioned that. There's, in many ways, this is something that stands for our history, our history, I mean, by like our collective worldwide history. And so that makes it that much more resonant and sad.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me at my first read of this poem was the reference to Babylon and Sumer. Those places haven't been called by those names in many, 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 many years, right? And in the point when they were called by those names, there were not rifles in them. There might have been warfare, but not rifles. And I think that that's what you're getting at, Molly, in terms of talking about the, this is in some ways very clearly attached to particular time, right? Rifles and gunpowder, but also static-borne television, and in other ways, and rotors and tanks, but in other ways carries us across time, and actually is doing that in very intentional ways to tell us this is a return to not just, those aren't just ancient cities, but they're also ancient cities that if you come out of a particular Western tradition, you think of as that have import in the development of that tradition. I'm also sort of like really curious about the caesuras and the other piece that this poem has. I like to, somebody who's taken poetry classes from me calls this Lois's $10 words. The other word is enjambment, right? So enjambment happens, I think, in just about every line in this poem, which is, it's when the phrase continues onto the next line, right? There's a phrase that starts on one line and continues onto the next line. Sometimes it will continue across multiple lines in a poem. And it's very different than poems that are end-stopped, right? So this poem could have been, there is this ringing hum, new line, this bullet-borne language, new line, ringing shell fall and static, new line, this late night ringing of threadwork and carpet, new line, ringing hiss and steam, new line, right? And you can play that game all through the poem. For you as a reader, what's the difference between a poem that is using these pauses in the middle of lines and then running an idea from one line into the next? How does that have a different effect on you than if it were more neatly end stopped at each line?
Well, it seems to me that the poet is almost suffering from PTSD, and he's trying to think of what's coming next, and he gets the first word out, and then he has to pause and contemplate what's going on, and continue it on the next line, both with changes from one line to the next and with the extra spaces between the words.
So it sort of adds an emotional tenor that we wouldn't have otherwise, to have it doesn't flow the way that we expect it to, and you're kind of tying that to an emotional state of being.
Yes.
And a few folks, I think, have jumped in to join us. We've just started talking about this poem, so feel free to share your observations as we go. Chris, have you got a hand up?
Yeah, I want to agree with Stan. I sort of felt the same thing, that I felt like I mean, obviously the sort of central image of this is your ears ringing after a loud explosion, and the disorientation of that, and then like how can you get your thoughts together, and I think I want to agree with Stan that it gives me that feeling of like I'm that as I step in for the poet, I find myself staggering through through a staggering landscape.
Right. And I have to say, when I read this out loud to all of you, as we started looking at it, I realized that the one line that does not, no, maybe there are two lines like this that don't have pauses built in. The line, ringing these children their gravestones. You have to read that all the way through. Ringing these children their gravestones. We don't want to hear about children and their gravestones. We don't want children to be laid to burial, right? And that line, I think the other line that I'm seeing it like that is ringing of midnight in gunpowder and oil. This and that again, that kind of drive of destruction, which echoes differently than when there are pauses. Sorry, Harper, were you going to jump in?
Oh yeah, and ringing kind of acts kind of in two ways, like when you're ringing in something, or like the ringing, like you're calling forth something as well as hearing something.
Oh yeah, you mean in the sense that we say this ringing in of the new year, like that?
Yeah, but that, like, ringing these children their gravestones, like, and ringing of midnight and gunpowder and oil. I think I read it initially as kind of that, obviously that memory of ringing, like that noise you can't like get away, but also again that action, like ringing these children their gravestones. I guess I kind of read this as, in a lot of ways, me ringing of midnight and gunpowder and oil, me ringing rifles in Sumer, ringing these children their gravestones. Like there's this action and this remorse also in that word.
Oh yeah, and as you were speaking, I was also thinking, like I've been thinking so much about the auditory every time I look at this poem, but that there's also, ringing can also mean a surrounding, right? Or a cordoning off, ringing these children their gravestones, ringing of midnight and gunpowder and oil. Like what do we try and ring off versus the phantom noise, right? To think about, Chris expressed it as this, the way that the ears ring immediately after an explosion. But for me, and Brian Turner's a poet who has served in the military, and a lot of his poems are about both moments of service, but also what veterans carry after their terms of service. So I think also about the cordoning off of what happened there versus my life here, what happened in that moment versus where I am in this moment, and yet a phantom noise keeps drawing me back in. Looks like Chris has a hand up.
I was just going to say it also somewhat references the child nursery rhyme, ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, they all fall down, which in this case fall down meaning they all die.
Yeah, right. That for us, there's another ringing association there. Any more thoughts on this before we move on? And this might be a good moment. I didn't ask you this at the beginning of the session, to think about, what does the word veteran conjure up for each of us, and where does our sense of it come from? And maybe I'll actually unshare so I can look at all of you for this piece of the conversation, because I think that as we move into the next set of photographs is worth thinking about, like, where do our ideas about veteran come from? Is it from a personal relationship that we have as veterans, or to veterans that we know, or from other places in our culture? guys are so quiet tonight. Chris?
Well, for me, it's a complicated one. I as somebody who was determined not to become a veteran during the Vietnam War, I primarily think of them as victims, as people who sort of patriotically stood up and made tremendous sacrifices to achieve dubious ends at best, if not evil ends. So I think of them largely in that context, but I also think of them as people who are sort of continuing to suffer from the sacrifices that they made, and who need to be taken care of, which they would be better if so many of them weren't Black and Hispanic.
Or working class. I think that the not having a draft has made joining the military something that's often a thing about class and economic possibility and opportunity and limitations, as well as other things too. My father was my grandfather, not my father, my grandfather was a veteran. He died before I was born. But aside from knowing that he had served in World War I, nothing about his veteran status was ever talked about. And I don't come from a military family. And I think it's really different for people who do come from military families. And I was born in 1968, so my parents are older, but many of my peers, I think, were born specifically to try and get their fathers out of the draft, right? So I'm a generation that is in some ways shadowed by the Vietnam War, having always been that experience that, Christopher, you're talking about coming to when you were at draft age. But thinking about this program and thinking about our 21st century wars, right? Our longest war, we are just now ending. And what that means around veteran status. I'm gonna, for the next image, I'm gonna show it really quickly. The last image, I was like, take a long time and look at it. And this is in some ways, like, what does first impressions do for us in the image? So let's go back. And I'll give it to you quickly, and then I'll take it away, and then I will bring it back. I hope that was fast enough. This is more about the quick impressions of the image. And I know some of you are familiar with it. Some of you have been looking at it each day in the gallery. But what struck you from the image? What did you take in most immediately? Molly?
I would say the arrangement of the image of the objects. To me, that just drew me in, and the Bible, but also the war nature of the Bible, and then the knife adjacent, and so even kind of creating a relationship between the two, those two objects, or the placement of them was doing.
Right, so we've got a Bible, but it's a well-worn one. We've got a knife and their proximity to each other. Chuck, what were you going to say?
I mean, when I saw it just flashed so fast on the screen, I was like, Abraham and Isaac. That was my first thought.
Do you want to tell folks why, for those who may not be raised in the Abrahamic traditions?
Abraham is called upon to sacrifice Isaac with a knife, and called by God, and then God says at the last minute, nope, I was just kidding, I was just testing you. So thanks for almost killing your son, but I was just going to see how far you'd go. But it's interesting to me when I look at this inside the vehicle and see the knife in the Bible, they're to me objects that whoever owns them is trying to keep themselves safe with, is the other thought. Like, you're looking for some kind of protection from and I don't know really anything about the thought processes of the person who actually owns these objects, but what comes to mind is I need to be safe, and I need some sort of reassurance, either by my own hand or by the hand of God.
Yeah, and I would also add in your Abraham and Isaac explication that I believe in Islam, that is not a story about Abraham and Isaac, but a story about Abraham and Ishmael, right? So even our read on it comes through a particular tradition. So now I've put the image back up for you to take a little more time with. Is there, as we look at it more detail to notice, more nuance, or was our first impression all that there was to see in terms of the photograph? Chuck?
I mean, I'm sorry, I came in late, and I don't know how many of these photographs you've shown from this.
This is the first one we've seen from this series. So we saw some from the other photographer earlier.
I think it's also striking, having seen this whole series physically in the gallery, that also these objects look like they're really important. There's no other really sense of clutter in here. Like there's not any other sort of just things happen to be lying on the car floor, like might be lying on our car floor. It just feels like these are really, and that makes these objects seem they're much more crucial or really important. They're kind of foregrounded in a way because there's not a lot of other clues.
Yeah, although when I look at this image now, after what you said before about like, these are both items used for protection, right? The Bible and the knife. I'm also struck by the fact that the seatbelt is there, right? That we see the place the seatbelt should click into, which is also a kind of protection. And I think that may be a bit subtler in terms of how the photograph is framed, because it is so large in the foreground and there's very little color in this photograph, so that the red of that seatbelt clicker kind of pops more as I look at it. Molly, what did you want to add?
Yeah, building on that idea that Chuck is talking about, and kind of these objects, not necessarily for protection, but also maybe elements of survival. If you're going to grab two objects that mean something to you when you go into the car, and I'm thinking about this in relation to some of the other pictures that are on the walls that Chuck and others have seen, whereas this is pretty sparse compared to some of the others, but these two objects seem to be of import, like very important to this the owner of the car. So they obviously hold some great significance, and they are about maybe survival and persevering from day to day.
Yeah, and Ken has also given us sort of a somewhat formal reading of the photograph, talking about in the chat about the horizontal, the sort of lines on the door of the elements of the car itself, and then how the knife responds to that. And then this question about like, what is going on? Is that a cup with liquid in it? I think it might be an ashtray, but I can't figure out. I'm saying that because of the notched edges, but I can't kind of figure out why it's so tall as an object. Anybody have any?
Yeah, I think if you see at the bottom part of what is either the ashtray cup, the bottom part of the top circle, I think there may be a hole there that you actually, once you've put out your butt, you put the butt in the hole, and it fills the cup up with ashes.
Yeah. I'm going to jump us to the next image, if that's okay with folks, unless anybody is holding back on anything. All right. What does this image do that is similar to or contrasts with the last one? Chris?
Well, I think the last one, we were talking about how, here are my two protections that are durable and that I can depend on. And this contrasts with that. Let me just say.
In what way? Say
this,
more about what you are seeing.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of this patriotic machine gun that's just air and plastic and is all smashed up in the door. Don't depend on that.
Yeah, like I want to make it something else in my mind. Like I want to make it a super soaker, one of those giant water guns. Like I'm concerned about the fact that we use guns as water pistols and water super soakers, but at least that would have some function. Like I cannot figure out what this inflatable is supposed to do in the world. Like what does it do in the world except conflate US flag, gun, and play, right? This is clearly meant for play. It's a toy of some sort. Other things that strike folks about this image.
Well, perhaps this is more symbolic, meant to be more symbolic than than anything else. Perhaps the owner is it's not a false sense of protection, but maybe a safer one, or maybe a way to honor experience. But the real thing is too tough, too hard to deal with. So it's something else, becomes something else or stands for something else. It stands for an experience, but maybe it's more just a kitschy choice of that experience.
It is so kitschy, and in some ways its kitschiness troubles me more than an actual knife. Like an actual knife might be about function or a real belief that one needs protection, whereas to me it's weirdly making a game of all of it. And the fact that it's like a high-powered automatic rifle, right? I don't know enough about weapons to know what I'm describing, but it's like, if this were a gun, this would be a serious killing machine. And so it's the fact that it's plastic and flimsy, and as Chris pointed out, already smashed in the doorway of the car or by the door of the car, makes it, to me, much more perverse as an object. And I'm also like, what about this pink garment that it's lying on top of? Like, what do you make of that?
I don't know anything about how child seats are attached to cars, but the two buckles on the seat belts there look like it might be something to attach a child's car seat to the car. And whether or not that's the case, I don't know. And perhaps this is a child's inflatable gun, and the pink fuzzy coat, whatever it is part of the some of the things for the child. But that's just pure speculation.
Yeah, I think that the seat belts facing that way just tell us that there are 3 seats across in this vehicle. So it might be the second row of seats in a minivan. It's not necessarily that it's telling us that assembly is there, I think, for a car seat necessarily, but it does tell us a little bit about the kind of vehicle that this is. And definitely, like the pink fuzzy sweatshirty thing, I'm just wondering who's wearing that. I'm not picturing a pink fuzzy sweatshirt on the individual with the Holy Bible and knife car. So who is in this car, and what's the relationship between who's wearing the sweatshirt and who's playing with this gun? Molly, what were you going to say?
Yeah, actually, I think Chris, you had your hand up first. You want to go ahead? Okay. Well, I was just going to say that just speaking to that, like these two objects let us know that there is someone else. There's someone else involved in this, and so many of the images in this series, and I will even say, I see them as like these psychological portraits that the artist has referenced. But here, there's someone else involved, and obviously someone younger who is perhaps equally or in a different way impacted by the veteran's experience. And now it's being sort of passed down by this not so cool toy, so.
I mean, and that not so cool toy is definitely our impression. Other people would feel like it's really important to teach
Right.
racism, and that defending your country is an incredibly important thing to do. So that's like a totally subjective value that
Yeah.
feels like it may be a
Totally.
commonality for us, but it's not necessarily a universal.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that we had a show in the early 80s by Mauro Altamora that appeared to be aerial photographs taken in Vietnam of kind of structures made of maybe like bamboo scaffolding kind of things. But as you looked at them, so you're thinking, oh, these are pictures, war pictures. Right. And then as you kind of looked at them more, you realize, well, your sense of scale was off, and that these were actually like little sticks and twigs of a child's construction. And the show did a really good job of sort of saying, well, what's the relationship between playing war as a kid and finding yourself in the middle of a war as an adult?
Yeah. And I think that the kidness of this car, like one of the things when I look at this picture, I realized about the last picture we looked at, and Chuck said, that car didn't have any clutter in it, but its seats also were pretty pristine, right? This is a car with stained seats, which is not always, but often the sign of a car that has had children in it. So that also seems to fit with that reading. Any more thoughts on this photo before we move on? I'm going to ambitiously take us through 2 more poems and another photograph. So hang in there, friends, hang in there. This poem is The Long Deployment, and I have to move things around on my screen so that I can actually read all of it. The long deployment. For weeks, I breathe his body in the sheet and pillow. I lift a blanket to my face. There's bitter incense paired with something sweet, like sandalwood left sitting in the heat, or cardamom rubbed on a piece of lace. For weeks, I breathe his body. In the sheet, I smell anise, the musk that we secrete. With longing, leather and moss, I find a trace of bitter incense paired with something sweet. Am I imagining the wet scent of peat and cedar, oud, impossible to erase? For weeks, I breathe his body in the sheet. Crushed pepper, although perhaps discreet, difficult for someone else to place. There's bitter incense paired with something sweet. With each deployment, I become an aesthete of smoke and oak. Patchouli fills the space. For weeks, I breathe his body in the sheet until he starts to fade, made incomplete, a bottle almost empty in its case. There's bitter incense paired with something sweet. And then he's gone. Not even the conceit of him remains, not the resonance base. For weeks, I breathed his body in the sheet. He was bitter incense paired with something sweet. So this poem is a villanelle, which is it's a take on the villanelle, which is a form in which lines are repeated and often changed a little bit. And this is such a olfactory poem. How does it compare to the visual in our world of photography to have something that is so olfactory? Somebody jump in.
Well, I think it compares in that it's about sort of paying close attention and to detail and to what the resonance of those details might be.
Other thoughts on the poem?
Well, I think in many ways I still conjure up the visual alongside of it. So it's like expanding my senses because I'm smelling, but I'm also imagining this kind of scene playing out. So I think it makes it richer when it's a focus on these like it's multi-sensory in many ways. So it kind of digs deeper, becomes really rich as as we're reading a book and we're conjuring up that scene in our minds. This is doing that, but the smell is so strong, and I try and parse out the different smells.
And because I'm an idiot, I didn't realize until we were looking at the Brian Turner poem that the Brian Turner poem is also appealing to a sense that isn't the visual, right? So that poem is all about the auditory, and yet it conjures up many visual images or many scenes that we can imagine in our mind's eye, whereas this poem is the same scene over and over again. And really what's central to that scene is absence, right? That there's a body of the beloved who is deployed, and that body is not in the scene that we're seeing. Other thoughts about this poem? And Chris, you've got a hand up. And I'll throw out another question. For those of you who know the poem, probably the most famous villanelle in English is the Dylan Thomas poem, "Do Not Go Gently Into That Dark Night." And if you know that poem, you might think about what that poem's about versus what this poem is about, and what the effect that has. But Chris, what were you going to say?
I was going to say it's the change of tense to the past tense at the end is very alarming,
Because
it makes you think this person is not coming back. It's a forever deployment.
yeah, and I read the poem over and over again, and I think actually what it does brilliantly is that it's not entirely clear if that's the case, right? That's one reading. And the other reading is simply that the deployment has gone on so long that the scent is gone, right? I think about this most strongly with people I know who have lost family members and say, I keep this thing because it has their smell. And at some point it just stops being there, and it's just your memory of the smell rather than the smell. But it doesn't mean that this person is dead. It may just be that the scent is what's gone, right?
Yeah, there's an interesting sort of wonderful tradition in colonial America, at least, of when your husband died, the widow would gather up his clothes and make a quilt, which is something that takes a long time, but ultimately gets finished. It's this sort of wonderful grieving ritual. And
Yeah.
of course, the clothes still smell like your husband the whole time, and you're working closely with them. And I thought that was a very powerful ritual that somebody created.
Right. Other thoughts on this poem or questions about this poem? I will say that in the villanelle form, this is actually longer than a villanelle traditionally is. And the poet says about this poem, it goes on long, maybe too long. And I think that that's also part of the that idea of the length of the deployment, and particularly that repetition of the lines. For weeks, I breathe his body in the sheet. And that line gets repeated. And also there's bitter incense paired with something sweet. Those are the two lines that in the villanelle form would always be repeated, but you could see the way that they change. For weeks, I breathe his body, period, in the sheet. For weeks, I breathe his body in the sheet dash, like we want to get on to the next line. For weeks, period, I breathe his body in the sheet until he starts to fade, made incomplete. So that thinking about not just repetition, but variation within repetition is really interesting in this poem. Okay, one more photograph and one more poem. Are you ready? What should we notice about this image? And is there any way to look at it without it being framed by the other photos in the series or by the poem we just looked at? Or do we want to use those things to frame our reading of this photo?
Chris?
Well, I read it as a sort of a cheap trinket carrying a very heavy emotional weight. I mean, hopefully it works better than that inflatable machine gun in achieving its purpose. But you know, it's interesting to kind of think about the sort of a small gesture that you make having a much bigger impact than you would expect it to. To me, that's my sort of reading of it. It's like, oh yeah, this is for you, Dad or honey or whatever, and that it sort of has become a amulet, a talisman, something powerful.
Right, and Dad could also be Mom. We have many, many more women veterans.
True.
I mean, what else do we notice about this picture? Chuck?
I just like the contrast of there's the black edges of the windows, the blue sky, the gray and the red. There's just the car in the image is either gray or black. And there's the red of the heart and the sort of blue of the sky. And you almost feel like, oh, the heart is floating up into the sky, or it's placed against the kind of the backdrop of the blue sky of possibility, but you're still just sort of trapped in the car on the ground. So there's I don't know. This picture makes me impossibly sad. I'm very hard. It's very hard for me to like kind of recuperate any joy looking at it, to be honest.
That is so interesting because I have the opposite impression of this. I will hold my thoughts. Molly, tell us what you're thinking, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, I see it actually as a symbol of hope, but also in looking again at the entire series and the objects, even the past two images we looked at of Castiles, is what people hang on to and what is, Chris mentioned the notion of the talisman, but it is that idea of, what is important to people. And I think that's what a lot of this work does is bring forth the things that people hang on to, like literally, the things we have in our car, we don't necessarily have them there. Oftentimes they're there for a reason, or the objects that stay around, if it's not the junk or the wrappers or things like that. So it could be a reminder, it could be it could be a gift that was given, but there's a reason that it's there, and that's to me what makes it compelling. And it's not usually a place you would hang an object because it's sort of an odd place, but obviously it's something that's of meaning to the owner of the car. So
yeah, I feel like in some ways somebody has gone to the effort of securing this in this particular place, which is a little bit of a weird place. And like when I look at the object, I can imagine that it took a little bit of finagling to get it there, which may also tell us that this is somebody who's like, hanging that from the rear view mirror would be a bad idea because it would block my vision, or maybe it would block my wheelchair placard because I'm disabled because I served, right? And to me, this is such a happy, hopeful image. The blue skies, it's not just a plug for the gallery. The blue sky is a beautiful, lovely image. And the brightness of the sun on the heart, to me, it's really buoying. And in fact, I saw this picture twice and thought that there was a balloon in it, that it was a balloon and not, it's actually some hard plastic, tchotchke of some origin, but that it felt I think I thought balloon because it buoyed me in some way. So it's really interesting to hear somebody else read it as such a sad image, because I like the idea that wherever else I'm going, like tucked in the corner is my knowledge that of you and me, and that is this little source of joy inside, like whatever else I have to get done as I drive around in my car today. Ken says in the chat, it feels like you're looking up, like you're riding in the passenger seat and looking up, which maybe is part of my notion of the hopefulness of it, that things, including I, am literally looking up. Other thoughts on this one? Well, then there's one last thing I wanted to share, which is this very short poem. Oceanside, California. Balancing on crutches in the shallows near her mother, a girl missing her right lower leg swings her body and falls, laughing. Behind them, her father and brother play catch. Up the beach, the incoming tide nibbles a sleeping woman. Another beer is opened. A young veteran walks by with a high and tight buzz cut and Semper Fi shoulder tattoo, his right leg a prosthesis to mid-thigh. He approaches the family, removes the prosthesis, I can't say that word tonight. He approaches the family, removes the prosthesis, and joins the girl in the water. They lift shorn legs high and smack them down. No one talks about the war. I'm going to read it again. Oceanside, California. Balancing on crutches in the shallows near her mother, a girl missing her right lower leg swings her body and falls, laughing. Behind them, her father and brother play catch. Up the beach, the incoming tide nibbles a sleeping woman. Another beer is opened. A young veteran walks by with a high and tight buzz cut and Semper Fi shoulder tattoo, his right leg a prosthesis to mid-thigh. He approaches the family, removes the prosthesis, and joins the girl in the water. They lift shorn legs high and smack them down. No one talks about the war. Is this a hopeful ending for this poem, for the Salon, for America's longest war? Tell me about this poem. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a hopeful ending. I mean, I remember when I read the Iliad as part of being a Reed freshman, and there you have to study the ancient Greeks. I wrote a paper saying that the Iliad, which was about the Trojan War, which is one of these wars like we have in the Middle East that just goes on forever. The book ends at a moment that appears to be a moment of the oncoming of peace, although actually it isn't. But and I think that's what this poem does. It's kind of like, okay, this is a sort of a we're still us. We're still able to lift our legs high and smack them down, and play in the water. And I think it's not pretending that nothing bad happened, but it's hopeful that we can abide.
It's funny. I taught that class at Reed. I taught at Reed for 3 years, and every year I taught that class. So it's always the first text you teach to the incoming students. And when I would explain my pedagogy, I would say, the first question I would give them is the Iliad a pro-war text or an anti-war text? And I said, I don't care what your answer is. I care how well you can support your answer with textual evidence. So you have come right at my pedagogy with that reference to the Iliad. Chuck, you had a thought about the poem?
Just that, unlike that heart hanging from the rear view or from the side of the passenger seat, this is so happy. Like, we don't even know the relationship of the girl to the family, but it starts with her laughing. It starts with this sort of using her body as it is and falling. We get the feeling that she's probably pretty at ease in her body, and that the guy with the prosthesis is too. Like, it's sort of, this is after, this feels like after the war, like, and everyone is just coming back to life and taking this moment of joy. It's great.
Yeah, although I mostly agree with your sentiment about the poem, although I think it's important to note that we don't know that it starts with her laughing, right? Balancing on crutches in the shallows near her mother, a girl missing her right lower leg swings her body and falls. All of that can sound like my heart is in my mouth, right? Like somebody's balancing on crutches in the shallows. What could happen to them? Near her mother, oh my heavens, it's a child. It's a girl. She's not just injured, she's missing her right lower leg. Oh no, she swings her body and she falls. Oh no, like, and then the word laughing, like, tricky little poet, the way that you've done that. You've set me up, and then instead of yanking the rug out from under me, it's like you wrapped the rug around me instead and comforted me with this child's laughter, right? So I think that you're right that she is comfortable in this body, and then this tough guy, young veteran, right? Buzz cut and Semper Fi shoulder tattoo. So that buzz cut tells us that this is either somebody who's recently out of the service or somebody who is still so attached to their identity that, along with the tattoo, the permanent marking of Semper Fi, the buzz cut is retaining, I guess, young veterans, so they can't have been out that long, but is retaining that soldier identity, who's like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have so much fun together. We can both play with our legs in a way that none of these other people can. Let's totally do this. Other thoughts about the poem or how it can shape our understanding of the photographs that we've looked at, or how the photographs might shape our understanding of the poem? And I will say, I like Castile's work a great deal, but I wonder and even worry about the extent to which it may be othering the veterans. That is to say, we're staring into their cars and maybe finding ourselves judging them because we're seeing the interiors of their cars without seeing them as people. And we want to read things into what we find in their cars. I will say, the first time I saw the show, I went home and I cleaned out my car, like totally felt like I didn't want to judge myself in the same way, or have anybody judge me in the way that I might have been judging those interiors. And then I wanted also for us to end in particular with a young veteran active and in motion, and not in the car, but in the world in this way. And I do wonder about that aspect of the show for those of you who have seen it. Does it feed a way in which we other and even become negatively read veterans? Molly, what were you going to say?
Well, I think speaking to that, and of course, like, hearing Matthew talk about the project, I think that was not, that's not an intention nor a takeaway. I think that he hopes people will have, and it's a way of kind of understanding the implications of war through these clues that are provided in veterans' cars, and not a way to make judgment. And I think that's one of the things he hopes, he hopes he's not doing, or he does not choose to do, but just a peek into the experience of those who have endured war, and almost like these like psychological portraits that let us know the struggles and the long-lasting effects, and also the things that that veterans might rely on and need, and kind of some of their coping mechanisms, whether they're healthy or not, coping mechanisms, but that it's kind of a reality rather than a judgment. But this is a true, reality for so many who have been in war and survived war.
Right, and whether any of our coping mechanisms are healthy or
right,
unhealthy.
right, yeah. But the fact that the war, and I think that's why the work with Justina's work and Matthew's are really interesting in combination, because one is about kind of the moments of war, and another project is about kind of the lifelong aftermath and experience with that.
Right, that in entitling this session, I called it There, Here, War,
Right.
because I think that is a difference, the there and the
Mhm.
here.
Yeah.
Chris, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, when we were looking at this in the exhibition committee, we had some concern, at least I had some concern about whether the work was going to be perceived by veterans in the way that you're describing, that it was stereotyping them as these PTSD time bombs that we should be afraid of or whatever, you know. And so I went to, before we approved it, I said, let me talk to Jim Lomason, who's done some very extensive work with veterans of the Gulf War, and let me have him run this by some people and make sure that it's not going to be hurtful to veterans, or perceived that way. And when I heard that he had given us 119 pictures to put up, I was like, what? But I think it actually diffuses that question quite a bit, because when you come into the gallery, it looks like, oh, I'm being presented with some data to draw my own conclusions, rather than what is this guy trying to tell me about veterans? Where's he coming from? You know, so it feels much more like a survey and less like a polemic.
And I was thinking, as I was preparing for tonight, but the very first of the salons that we did online, where we were so young then. We didn't know how long the gallery would be closed. We didn't know anything. We were so young then. It was April. Maybe it was the very beginning of May. And I had just chosen, because there wasn't work up in the gallery necessarily, I had just chosen 2 of the exhibitions that I hadn't gotten to do in-person programs for, one of which was the Bedroom Project, which has photographs of women who've been incarcerated after their release in their bedrooms. And in that work, Sarah Bennett is the photographer, but we were talking about one of the women in her bedroom, and one of the participants in the salon said, you know, I used to be in the military, and as somebody who has had that relationship to an institution, I read this space really differently. And they were talking about sort of their commonality to this space. It was specifically about keeping your clothing and your possessions in big plastic tubs rather than unloading them and putting them into furniture. And this person said, you know, when you are used to being deployed by the military, you always feel, even though she said, I've been out for years, but I still feel like at any point I could be ordered to move by the institution. And so I still comport myself that way. And just thinking about the many ways that we carry experiences, and particularly that people who served in the military carry those experiences. And what does that mean about how differently we move through the world? Anybody have any more final thoughts as the incoming tide is nibbling at our time? All right, I think the next time we're doing this is actually fairly soon, right, Molly? Were we planning on August 11th? Does that still work?
Yeah. Our next show goes up next Thursday, and the following Wednesday, which is the 11th, Lois will be doing Refocusing on that show, which is Ingeborg Gerdes, a memorial retrospective of her work here. And this current show is up through Saturday. So
if you want to see this, you've got a few more days. And I believe that the gallery is a nice, cool space on hot days in Portland. Is that correct?
It's very cool. It's in fact cold. So so come on down. It's great space, and you need a lot of time to see both shows. You want to spend a lot of time with both of them. So so please come on down and join us.
All right. Well, thank you all for another great discussion, and we'll see each other in a couple of weeks.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lois, so much.
Lois.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye.